Well, as you know, the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, the children of Israel had moved to Moab region area. And they were, while there, looking across the Jordan into the promised land is where Moses gave his final speech, exhortation, which took about probably a few weeks, maybe 5 weeks. And that's what we have here in the book of Deuteronomy. And after taking so long to go through Deuteronomy, nobody should ever say, I have a long sermon again. This was a long sermon. And so we come here tonight as we are finishing the Torah, finishing the Pentateuch, finishing the first 5 books of the Bible. And we saw last week that Song of Moses, which was, fiery and prophetic, that before they get there, they were going to blow it and sin, and everything that God said would come upon them because they were not going to keep the law. And we find chapter 33 is a bit more encouraging, okay? But he says here in verse 1, and I'll just say right now, guys, in the Bible, sometimes you have good Hebrew to work with, and sometimes you have good Greek to work with, and sometimes you have horrible Hebrew and horrible Greek. And the translators, of course, I know Greek. I took 4 years of it. I don't know it anymore. I've taken a year of Hebrew. I don't really know it anymore. But I know where to go to find it, and the commentaries to study, and what it means to understand it. But, the book of 1 Peter is probably the best Greek we have in the New Testament. 2 Peter is probably the worst Greek we have in the New Testament. Most people think that Peter wasn't on the run in 1 Peter, and he had a scribe who was writing that book, he was writing the letter. But then 2 Timothy, the fisherman from Galilee had to kick in, and it wasn't so good. But nevertheless, God speaks his word through it. But yet we're reminded that even though it's the word of God, it was written by men. And sometimes we see those human elements in it, which again makes it more, in my mind, truthful. A truthful historical record. But he says here, now this is the blessing which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. Now here is a new title, Moses, the man of God. This is why a lot of writers believe that Joshua is probably the writer at this point, the last couple of chapters, filling in the information that Moses gave, and now Joshua is picking up his pen and finishing this book of Deuteronomy. So although Moses wrote everything up to this point, Joshua is the one who wrote this. Now, just so you know, Jewish tradition is that Ezra, way at the end of the history of Israel, you got Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther right at the end of the historical books there, that Ezra actually went through and re-edited and updated all of the Old Testament. That's what the Jewish tradition has. So some of them believe that this is Joshua writing, or even Eleazar the high priest is writing these last couple of chapters, and or Ezra editing it. But it is interesting. Moses said, he wrote, that he was the most beautiful child, and he didn't want to kill him. He also had to write, he was the humblest man on earth. But it's interesting, he never called himself a man of God. But here, he's now for the first time called a man of God. Joshua 14:6, Joshua would write that Moses was a man of God. In Judges 13:6 and 8, he was called a man of God. And in Psalm 90, he's called a man of God. But nevertheless, this was the blessing he put upon the people. So now it's almost like this is something that Moses is doing for the children of Israel that maybe he wasn't writing down. that this was something that he was just doing for them, but now Joshua records it. And I think that's a very good possibility. So Moses, like the patriarch, is sending on the blessing to the 12 tribes. We last saw this in Genesis 49 with Jacob. But remember who's the writer of Genesis? Moses, right? And Jacob writing, it says that he put a blessing on his sons. It wasn't so much of a blessing. Jacob was harsh with his 12 boys. And a lot of it was just prophecy, sort of, here's your future. There was not a whole lot of blessing going on in Genesis 49. Here it seems that Moses was trying to add more of a blessing than the prophetic prediction. But nevertheless, it says here in verse 2 and 3, and he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned from there from Mount Seir and shone forth from Mount Paran. And he came with the 10,000 of the saints. From his right hand came a fiery law for them. Yes, he loves the people. All the saints are in your hand. They sit down at your feet. Everyone receives your words. Now, this is 2 and 3 are some of the most controversial translated verses. And the problem is the two words, 10,000s of the saints, or the midrids of the saints, or the midrids of the holy ones. It's actually the word that we had back in chapter 32:51, Meribah Kadesh, the location. Remember Meribah Kadesh, where Moses got angry? Here, except for a couple little change of the letters, it's the word Meribah Kadesh, but it's being translated, rather than a location, it's being translated as a midrid of holy ones, or saints, or angels. So for example, the NIV wrote midrid of the holy ones. The Living Bible says 10,000s of holy angels. Deuteronomy, the Message Bible, MSB, says 10,000 holy angels. The Good News Translation says 10,000 angels. The New American Standard says the midrids of holy ones. The Contemporary English Version Bible said thousands of his warriors with him. The New Living Translation says Meribah Kadesh. It actually has the name that we saw again back in chapter 52, verse 31, with the flaming fire on his right hand. The same with Smith's literal translation. He came with 10,000s of Kadesh, or the word here, Cades, in some places is translated. So the actual word Meribah Kadesh is there. He came with his people from that location of Meribah Kadesh. Now, I'm going to show you, I wrote for you and I showed you some of the commentaries that I looked at and studied through and worked at. But Kennicott and Ewald, they adopt the interpretation, take both Hebrew words to the geographical sense. They render them Meribah Kadesh. They vindicate the translation by this. 1, on the circumstance of 3 preceding clauses containing names of places, and the 4th having 1, 2, by the change of a single letter. So Meribah Kadesh, it's actually Meribah Kodosh. There is a letter in our transliteration of an A to an O. But again, with tribal transmission, a lot of times when the scribes were transmitting, they would make such errors. And so their point is, if you look at the text in verse before that, it names all these places, Sinai and Seir and Paran and Meribah Kadesh. It follows geographically if you look at those locations. And then secondly, this name, Meribah Kadesh, occurs at the close of the last chapter, chapter 32, verse 51. This is where Moses says, I couldn't go into the promised land because of what happened at Meribah Kadesh. And then the third thing, the word constantly used for his saints, and he points out it's kodosh rather than kadosh. And the commentary of critical and explanatory on the whole Bible, he goes into a much more elaborate detail, and he comes down to the use of the holy ones, because it's in the feminine plural, would make sense if it were indeed angels. I'm going to read Dr. Utley here, the quote Dr. Utley there, referring in just a few verses earlier, Deuteronomy 32:51, there was a parallelism of Mount Sinai, Seir, and Paran. It appears not to refer to angels and does just refer to the place named either Meribah Kadesh. Such is in the translation of the New Living Translation, where it says Meribah Kadesh with the flaming fire of his right hand, and then the Smith Little Translation, he came from the 10,000 of the saints. Now, Utley says this, the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation from the Old Testament into the Greek, does refer angelic hosts in the passage. So the Greek Septuagint, when they translate this passage, they use the word angelic host. There's no doubt in the Greek Septuagint, instead of saying myriads of holy ones or myriads of saints or myriads of angels, it out and out, the Greek Septuagint says host of angels. This is an important note. He goes on to say, this passage is where the rabbinic theology gets the idea that the angels were the intermediaries between God and Moses in the giving of the law. Now, this is the only verse in the Old Testament. So in the New Testament, 3 different places it says, oh yeah, Moses got the law from the angels. And you sort of scratch your head and you go back and you read through Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and you're going, now, where was it the angels gave the law to Moses? We have this in Acts 7:53. Who have received the law by the direction of angels and have not kept it. In Stephen's sermon there. In Galatians 3:19. What purpose then does the law serve? It was added because of transgressions till the seed should come to whom the promise was made, and it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. And then Hebrews 2:2, referring back to the law, for if the word spoken through angels prove steadfast that every transgression and disobedience received a just reward. In other words, if you were judged by the law. These passages in the New Testament refer to the law given to Moses through the mediation of angels. Where does that idea come from? It comes from this verse in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2 and 3. So he goes on in verse 3 to say this, all his saints are in your hand. They sit down at your right hand. Again, in the Greek Septuagint, that's all the angels are there, sitting down at the feet of God, rather than his holy ones being referred to the children of Israel. Utley goes on to say this, the holy ones is simply referring to the people of Israel receiving the law from Mount Sinai. This is the first time use of the word saints as referring to God's chosen people. So I think it would read this way in Deuteronomy 33, 2 and 3. And he said, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned from there from Seir. He shone forth his Mount Paran. He came to the 10,000 of his saints, or he came to Kadesh Barnea with his holy ones, with Israel, the children of Israel, which I think is probably the closest translation. Rather than saying midrid of saints, it's actually, instead of Kadesh, Kodosh, as it says here, it's Kadesh. And it's just simply the location. So he's giving Sinai, Seir, Mount Paran, Kadesh. And then he came with a fiery law for them, again, referring to the children of Israel, not angels. Yes, he loves the people, his children of Israel. All his saints, the children of Israel, are in your hand. They, the children of Israel, sit down at your feet. Everyone, the children of Israel, receives your word. And they did receive the word. I mean, I didn't say they obeyed it. They weren't very righteous about it, but they didn't receive it. So, how many of you did I just tell you far more than you ever wanted to know about that verse? Okay, there's a few of you. Sorry about that. That's the price you pay coming to Wednesday nights.
Thank you for that anyway.
But if you ever get to ask the question, where does it say in the Old Testament that angels gave Moses the law? This is the verse that is taken out of the Greek Septuagint, which very clearly says that Moses received it from the angels. That's the only place in the entire Old Testament. So it's sort of cool here because, it says he came down. It was a fiery law. It was a fiery time, right? The smoke coming and people couldn't come near. But then it says he loves his people. God was giving the law because he loves his people. And all of these saints, they're in your hand. Moses is saying, they're all in your hand. I surrender them to you, Lord. They're in your care. Well, in verse 4 and 5 now, Moses commanded a law for us, a heritage of the congregation of Jacob. And he was king in Jeshurun. We studied that last week, the upright or righteous ones, another name for Israel. When the leaders of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. Now, we can't skip quickly by verse 4. Read it again. Moses commanded a law for us, the children of Israel, a heritage of the congregation of Jacob. Guys, may not mean a lot to you, but to a Jewish child, after the Shema, remember the Shema in number 6, the Lord our God is one Lord. After the Shema, this is the second most understood, taught, quoted verse by a Jew. This right here, Deuteronomy 33:4. They look at that verse and say, man, God gave us the law. Out of all the people in the world, it was to Israel. He brought us out of Egypt. He brought us and spoke himself to us. He gave us Moses, who could talk to God as one man talks to another face to face. And Moses came off that mountain with his face shining. We couldn't even look at him. And there in the finger of God, he showed us the law. A Jew who understands the scripture, this verse 4 of Deuteronomy 33 greatly, greatly humbles them. Remember when Paul was speaking in Romans, and he said, well, you Gentiles might ask the question, well, what's the advantage of ever being a Jew? You remember Paul asking that question? In Romans chapter 3, verse 1 and 2, he says, what advantage then has the Jew? Or what profit is of circumcision? He says, much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God. In other words, I think we need to stop and understand. You go back to Genesis, and we finally get to the very end, and there's Joseph, and he's out in Egypt, and then the tribes come down, the brothers come down in Egypt. And you ask yourself at the end of Genesis, let's write down on a paper everything we know about God to this point in human history. You know what? You could get a paragraph. The revelation of God was so minimal. And then you say, well, what was written down? Nothing. It was oral tradition. And then 430 years, they're out. They're in Egypt. They grow in population. And then really almost the first time in human history, men began to document things as clearly about that time. And God gives Moses this incredible education in Egypt, a man who probably knew many different languages. As a small boy, learned how the best education there was in existence. And there he was able to go back and write for the first time all the oral tradition, Genesis. And then he began to document. And once he began to document, guess what continued to happen? All the way up. The history of the Jews continued to be documented. And there they had a completed Bible. Oh, there's thousands of Bibles of different types floating around the world. No, there isn't. In our modern day and age, you've got our Bible, you got the Quran, then you got maybe the Mormon Bible or something, but you don't. It basically comes down to two written words. The Quran, which, again, if you do any investigation upon the literature of that, and then just the content of what it actually says, you would quickly walk away saying, this isn't true. Like our forefathers of our country said, according to the God of nature and nature's God. In other words, we're going to govern because we believe God created this world and look at the order and orderliness and how things are designed. There's beauty, there's power, there's loveliness, there's gentleness, there's joy, there's so many things. God could have just made everything gray. If you're an evolutionist, that makes more sense, right? I mean, you get some bright, beautiful fish that starts getting legs and it climbs up on the shore, it's going to be seen in 8 and 2 seconds. No, the fact that there's color, and then the fact that there's all these different flavors and smells, an orange, a red apple, a yellow banana, so many different, these things that it's just like you begin to think of the nature of God. And then you look at the Bible. There is no other book in the world that's consistent with the God of nature and nature's God. And again, when you look at the Judeo part of the law and then the New Testament teachings of Christ and of the apostles, and you put those two ethics together, that's what's made our country great. And all the Western culture that everybody's wanting to flock to, it's because of such an ethic. So if you just look on the sheer practicality of what it says and what it creates. But nevertheless, here this verse 4 is just stopping to say, again, who are we, God? That we, out of all the people groups in the world, were the chosen people to receive this. Paul also says in Romans 9, verse 1 through 4, I tell the truth of Christ, I am not lying. My conscience also bearing me witness in the Holy Spirit, that I have great sorrow and continual grief in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh, who are Israelites. And now he's going to talk about all the things they've received, to whom pertain adoption, to pertain the glory, and what else? The covenants and the giving of the law, and then the service of God and the promises. These guys have been given so much and they still don't believe. And then he goes on in verse 5 to say, then they received the Messiah on top of that. Well, the next phrase in verse 5, moving on, he was king in Jeshurun. Now, the one thing that Moses was not was a king. Do you remember back when they were, there was a Dathan, Abiram, and they were trying to overthrow Aaron and Moses, and that's what they said. Oh, you're trying to become a king over us. And boy, Moses got upset. Going, I am no king. I've never acted like a king. This is not Moses. This is the first time where God is clearly proclaimed to be king over his righteous ones, his upright ones. Christ is the king of the upright ones. We do have a couple of things that were implied that God was king. For example, in Exodus 15:18, the Lord shall reign forever and ever. And then in Numbers 23:21, he has not observed iniquity in Jacob, nor has he seen the wickedness in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the shout of a king is amongst them. Those are two references, but now he is called king. And of course, as you study through the law, that's always clear. It always was understood that this whole system works. God is king, and everything is under his rulership. Now, why is that important? Because later on, when we get into Samuel and the people ask for a king like all the other nations, and God's going to get greatly offended, saying, you're going to do better than me? I'm your king. Well, now we're going to go through the tribes. Number one son, Reuben, right? Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few. So, if you remember, in Genesis 49, his father, Jacob, was still quite upset with Reuben, because in Genesis 35, it says that he went in and had sex with one of his father's concubines. And so in Genesis 49, 3-4, it says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of the dignity and the excellency of power, but then unstable as water. You shall not excel. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Now, here's another one of those translation things. The word nor, or in the negative, not, is not in there. The translators added that. You'll see it's in italics. So, nor let his men be few. Literally in the Hebrew, it just says, let his men be few. But rather than saying, it doesn't seem much of a blessing to say, let his men be few, it must have meant, nor let his men be few. In other words, don't let his tribe be a small tribe. But in actuality, what it actually says in the Hebrew is, Reuben live and not die. In other words, let his tribe not go extinct. But yet at the same time, the reality is, he's going to be a small people. He's going to be a few people. And that's exactly what happened in time. The tribe of Reuben had already, remember back, Moses got really upset. Reuben goes, hey, Moses, we're going to stay on the east side of the Jordan. Remember, Moses had a breakdown. You're going to do what your fathers did, and you're not going to cross over, and God's going to make everybody go back in the wilderness for another 40 years. And he goes, no, we're going over. We'll help battle. We just want to settle here at the end of the day. And he goes, okay, if you don't go over and help your brothers get their land until they have it, you can't come back, which would have been years and years and years. But if you don't do it, that sin will find you out. Very famous verse on that subject. But because he settled on the east side, he was one of the first tribes to compromise in idolatry, and he was the first tribe to be conquered by foreign lands. Nobody ever great came from the tribe of Reuben. No prophet, no judge, no king. Now some see that nor let his men be few is referring no longer to Reuben, but to Simeon. Now the only reason they say that is because Simeon is not listed. You're like, what? How could Simeon, one of the 12 tribes, not be mentioned? He's not mentioned here. In this chapter, Moses sort of puts a blessing on all the children, but he does not add one to the tribe of Simeon. Now, do you guys remember back the tribe of Simeon? You might remember the story in Genesis 34. Simeon and his brother Levi, they were two scoundrels. But their sister Diana, because they were all hanging out with the pagans, got taken by a guy named Shechem, and he raped her. And when he was done raping her, he's like, hey, I want to marry you now. And of course, they were infuriated, and they're like, is there anything we can do? And Jacob says, well, you guys would all have to become Jews. And to do that, you got to get circumcised. And they said, okay, we'll become Jews. And Jacob said, okay, then you can marry her. But why they were in pain from being circumcised, Levi and Simeon went down and killed them all. And took everything they had, including their wives and their kids, everything. And so we learn in Genesis 49, Jacob says about Simeon and Levi, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Instruments of cruelty are in their dwelling place. Let not my soul enter their council. Let not my honor be united to their assembly. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they hamstrung an ox. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, for their wrath, for it is cruel. And now listen to these last two phrases. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. What happened to the tribe of Simeon? They got scattered. We learn in Joshua 19:9. The inheritance of the children of Simeon was included in the share of the children of Judah. For the share of the children of Judah was too much for them. Therefore, the children of Simeon had their inheritance within the inheritance of that people. So basically, the tribe of Simeon melded into the tribe of Judah and intermarried there and lost their significance. Now, the question is, well, what happened to Levi? Well, let's go back and look at those last couple of things. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. You see, Levi, I would believe, was on the same path as Simeon. But we remember the story where they redeemed themselves. Remember the golden calf story in Exodus 32. And Moses said, that's it. And he got the calf and burned it and said everybody's going to drink it. And he's like, if you're for God, get on this back of me. If you're not. And only the tribe of Levi stood with Moses and God. And they warred against the children of Israel, and 3,000 died. And after that, God said, I'm not taking 10% of each of the tribes to be priests anymore. I'm just taking the tribe of Levi will be your priest now. And so is Levi one of the 12 tribes? No, they're not. Simeon ceased being a tribe, and Levi ceased being a tribe. But was Levi scattered, divided amongst Jacob? Was Levi scattered in Israel? They sure were. They didn't have a promised land, but they were scattered throughout Israel in the various cities to be the priests to all the children of Israel. So it's sort of a cool thing that God turned the curse into a blessing when it came to the tribe of Levi. Well, as you can imagine, I'm 40 minutes into this sermon, and we have gotten 6 verses. I obviously can't go this detailed on the rest of the brothers. So let's read here, though. In verse 7, Judah. This he said to Judah, hear, O Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. Let his hands be sufficient for him, and may you be a help against his enemies. So Judah, the actual name Judah means to praise. And of course, you see the pun there, if you would. Hear the voice of Judah, or the praise of Judah. And then the inference is he's a sufficient people, and he's going to fight against the enemies. And of course, we know the tribe of Judah became the kingly tribe. And that was the tribe of David, the mighty men of David. They fought the battle and won. And of course, in Genesis 40, 9:10, Jacob said about his son Judah, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. He prophesied that he would be the kingly tribe. And then the tribe of Levi now, he says, and of the Levi, he said, let your Thummim and your Urim be with your Holy One. Do you remember the Urim and the Thummim? The lights and perfection, somehow they worked so the high priest could know the will of God. It was kept in a bag, and the bag had a little pouch behind the breastplate of the high priest. And there he's talking about that. May the Urim and the Thummim be with the Holy One, the high priest, with whom you tested at Massah, and with whom you contended at the waters of Meribah, who says of his father and mother, I have not seen them, nor did they acknowledge his brother, or know his own children, for they have observed your word and kept your covenant. They shall teach Jacob your judgments and Israel your law. They shall put incense before you and the whole burnt offerings on your altar. Bless his substance, Lord, and accept the work of his hands. Strike the loins of those who rise against him. So he wasn't a warrior class. He was a priest class. But if somebody comes against him, he doesn't have to defend himself. You defend him, God. Strike the loins of the person. Ouch. And those who hate him, they rise not again, and kill off anybody who comes against the tribe of Levi to hate them. And then Benjamin. Oh, of Benjamin, he said in verse 12, the beloved of the Lord shall dwell in safety by him who shelters him all the day long, and he shall dwell between his shoulders. Of course, between your shoulders is your heart. And Benjamin was greatly beloved of his father, wasn't it? Remember, Jacob's favorite wife had Benjamin and Joseph, and he loved them. And really, it's saying here the love Jacob had for Benjamin and Joseph was really a love that God had for them as well. Well, then his brother Joseph, and boy, God, he really gets a lot of praise here. Verse 13 to 17. And of Joseph he said, blessed the Lord is in his hand, in his land, with the precious things of heaven, with the dew and the deep lying beneath, with the precious fruits of the sun, with the precious produce of the month, with the best things of the ancient mountains, with the precious things of the everlasting hills, with the precious things of the earth and its fullness, and the favor of him who dwells in the bush. Let the blessings come on the head of Joseph and on the crown of his head of him who separated from his brothers. Remember, he is separated. They sold him off to Egypt. His glory is like the firstborn bull, and his horns are like the horns of the wild ox. Together with them he shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. So there isn't particularly a tribe of Joseph. Joseph got two tribes, his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Well, in verse 18 and 19 now, we have Zebulun and Issachar. Those guys always seem to be together. I don't think they're twins, but they always go together. And Zebulun, he says, rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They shall call the peoples to the mountains. They shall offer the sacrifice of righteousness, and they shall partake of the abundance of the seas and the treasures hidden in the sand. And so their location is way down north, and basically going from the Sea of Galilee out to the Mediterranean Sea. They would have a route there, and they would become prosperous. And then Gad. Remember, Gad stayed on the other side with Reuben, but later he repented and came back into the land. And so of Gad he said, blessed is he who enlarges Gad, who dwells as a lion, that tears the arms of the crown of his head. He provides the first part of his himself, because the lawgiver portion was reserved there. He came with the heads of the people. He administered the justice of the Lord and his judgments with Israel. So Gad came back into the land, and on David's time, we learn in 1 Chronicles 12:14, for example, that the sons of Gad became the captains of David's armies. The least of 100 of them was the greatest, over 1,000. And then you got Dan in verse 22. And of Dan he said, Dan is a lion's whelp. He shall leap from Bashan. Now this is sort of strange because he says Dan, it's like he just said, he called these other guys lions. He's like, he's a lion's whelp. He's a wannabe lion, but never gets there. Now, if you look at this up here, and it has the location of the tribes of Israel, I would like you to notice where God gave Dan his portion was down here on the coast, not too far from Jerusalem. But yet things didn't go so well. And eventually the tribe of Dan migrated way up north, right below the Golan Heights. Now, when we go to Israel, this is where we go. And we go there to tell Dan because, remember, after Solomon, the kingdom broke into two. And Jeroboam had the northern kingdom, and Rehoboam, Solomon's son, had the southern kingdom. But up there they said, hey, the children of Israel keep going to Judah to worship. Build us a temple here. And Jeroboam goes, okay, we'll build a location with 2 golden calves. Back to the golden calf. And they built one there in Dan. And so I think this is saying it's prophesying that even though we know he's supposed to be going in the southern region, here it mentions him in the northern region. Well, back in verse 23 now. Naphtali. And of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of the Lord, possess the west and the south. Do you guys remember this? Remember the prophecy of Jesus, the Messiah? Jesus, the Messiah, would come out of the land of Naphtali. That's where he would come from. And I believe this is what it's speaking of. That key portion around the Sea of Galilee where Jesus would do his teaching and his ministry. And then the next in verse 24 and 25 is Asher, who happens to also be one of Santa Claus' reindeers. But it's a different Asher. Just don't get him confused, okay? Anyway, verse 24. And of Asher he said, Asher is the most blessed of sons. Let him be favored by his brothers, and let him dip his foot in oil. Your sandals shall be iron and bronze. As your days, so shall your strength be. That's a great saying, isn't it? As your days, so shall your strength be. Seen that posted in a lot of places? Great little line there. But here he's saying, you're not going to just get oil poured on you. You're going to be so successful, you can soak your feet in oil. Now, there are some people who believe this is a secret key to where the oil reserves in Israel are. And there have been millionaires, billionaire tycoons who have gone to this area of Asher, drilled for oil in Israel. They found a little bit, but not enough to drill for it. I wonder if you could find oil anywhere. Anyway, they found some oil there, but not enough to dig there. Although in the last few years, they have found Israel, finally in Israel, but it's way up in the Golan Heights area. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Verse 26 to 29, we finish up here. There is no one like the God of Jeshurun, the God of righteousness, the God of the upright ones, who rides the heavens to help you, and in his excellency on the clouds. The eternal God is your refuge, and underneath are the everlasting arms. He shall thrust out the enemy from before you, and will say, destroy. Then Israel shall dwell in safety, the fountain of Jacob alone, in the land of grain and new wine. His heavens shall also drop dew. Happy are you, O Israel, who is like you, O people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help, the sword of your majesty. Your enemies shall submit to you, and you shall tread down the high places. You know, as we know the history of Israel, outside of a time in David and maybe Solomon, this verse 26-29 isn't true of Israel. So I wonder if this isn't prophetically of the millennial reign, where we do see the Lord ruling in such a beautiful place and Israel being such a delightful place. But boy, it's sure sweet to read about how the Lord's heart is to bless Israel. Well, now we come to the final chapter, Deuteronomy 34. And as we come to this chapter, we find that Moses went out of the plains of Moab, and he is heading up to Mount Nebo. Yeah, all of those had it. And here's Mount Nebo. Here's the northern part of the Dead Sea. Here's Jericho, right across the way. And here's the mountain. And of course, it's almost right behind Jerusalem. Now, this goes from the lowest place on planet Earth, the Dead Sea, about 1,600 feet. It keeps dropping. The Dead Sea is losing a lot of water every year. It's really in a bad place. So it may be like 2,000 feet below zero. Now it keeps dropping. When I first went there, it was like 1,400 feet below sea level. Then the next time I went, it was like 1,600 feet. Next time, 1,800. I really don't know how deep it is. It's the lowest place on planet Earth. You know something interesting about here, and also Galilee below sea level also, 800 feet below sea level. You know what's interesting about those two places? When you go up in the mountains, you actually lose oxygen. It's harder to breathe. But when you go below zero, there's actually more oxygen. It's easier to breathe. And so you come off Mount Nebo down here, and then you go up 3,000 feet. You have the Mount Zion here. And then it goes downhill to sea level at the Mediterranean Sea. And so we have a few pictures here of the area of Mount Nebo that Josh is going to scroll through there for you. And then we have some pictures of Mount Nebo itself. And then we'll finish with the 12 tribes of Israel. Slide once again. That is the actual picture of Moses. Now, I have been to Jordan many times, and I've almost made it to Mount Nebo on the Jordan side, but I have not. But I guess there's that one right there. Can you blow that up? That sort of points out where the various locations are to be able to see. And as you can see, I don't think even on the best of days you can see the Mediterranean Sea from there. But in this passage here today, it appears that God helped Moses to do so. Well, let's look at verse 1 through 3. Then Moses went up to the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, the mountain range, which is across from Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead, as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim, Manasseh, and all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the south, the plain of valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. So back in these days, again, King David, there was all kinds of lions and bears and all kinds of trees. They were, Israel was deforested during many battles. So I think he would have been looking at a lush valley with beautiful trees. And of course, Dan, remember Dan was right on the ocean. It was right on the Mediterranean Sea. So it says here you could see all the way to that land, if not to the sea itself. And in verse 4, and the Lord said, "This is the land of which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will cause you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Man, that must have been a real mixed blessing for Moses. I mean, it's like showing you a giant chocolate eclair on the other side of the glass, and it says close sign on the door of the bakery, It's like, now I want to go more than I've ever wanted to go. But yet he can't. In verse 5 through 8, so Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, the country of Jordan today, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, very pagan place. But no one knows his grave to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished, which, if you guys remember back in chapter 31, verse 2, it says that Moses could no longer go out or in, or go forward or backwards, or whatever it said. And it made it sound like he was feeble. But we come here going, no, it had nothing to do with feeble. It's almost the opposite. It's like Moses was 120 years old, but he had many years to live, but yet there was no place for him to go. God wouldn't let him go back into the land of Moab or heading back to Egypt to dwell, keep wandering around as in tents. He wasn't going to live anymore. There was no place on earth for him. He couldn't go forward in the promised land. He couldn't go backwards. He was 120 years old, full of life, many years to live, but yet God said no. And the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. That's how long they wept for Aaron as well. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses ended. So clearly he did not die because he was on there weak and, oh, I'm 120, man, I've been dying for 3 years. Oh. That wasn't the case. He was full of strength and life and vigor, and his eyes could see better than anybody can today, all the way to the Mediterranean. Interesting stories with Jewish history. Jewish history actually says that God took him up on the mountain and God laid him down and kissed him and he died. Thus we have the saying, the kiss of death. That's where it comes from, the Jewish belief on how Moses died. But it appears that God buried him there. Now we find out sometime later. The first time we hear about it is from Origen in 185 to 254 AD. He said that he had read in a book called The Assumption of Moses that no longer existed. And a matter of fact, when he was quoting it, he said the book no longer existed, but he had read it at one time. And it was the story that we see in the book of Jude. In Jude 1:9, do you remember that story? Yet Michael, the archangel, in contending with the devil, when he disputed about the body of Moses, dared not bring against him a reviling accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." So it's interesting that, you go, hey, what's Satan thinking about today? Man, no telling what that guy's thinking about. I mean, he really was plotting and planning, going, I'm going to hang out in the, over behind the rocks, Yeah, as soon as Moses dies, breathes his last, I'm going to run over there and possess his body. And I don't know what he had in mind. But somehow Satan, one of his diabolical tricks was to get the body of Moses and do something with it, devilish, whatever it was, to no doubt bring confusion and deception and all manners of evil. But Michael, I guess he might have been in charge of burying Moses. And so as Moses' body was being buried in a hidden place, Satan was there to observe this. And even then, Michael, it's almost like there's still a hierarchy of what is it? Yeah, of the archangels. And even though Michael's an archangel, Lucifer used to be the chief of all angels, that even then, he didn't directly rebuke Satan. He said, the Lord has told me to do this, and you're getting in God's way. I rebuke you. The Lord rebukes you. And stop that trick of Satan. A rather interesting story, isn't it? Well, we come to verse 9. So now Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom. The last time we saw that was when the artisans were building the tabernacle. The artisans came out, and remember, God filled them with the spirit of wisdom to know the craftsmanship in building the articles of the tabernacle. For Moses had laid his hands on him. That's a tradition we carry into the New Testament, isn't it? To lay hands, to say, we recognize that God's raising you up into a position of leadership in the church. And so he did that, and I'm sure Joshua appreciated that. There is something special when people support you and believe in you. This year, you might have been here on the Wednesday night where God led Dennis to say, hey, let's lay hands on the pastor and pray for him. That was such a blessing. And there is something special about laying hands on people. And so we finished in verse 9. So the children of Israel heeded him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. That's sort of funny, isn't it? It's like, we'll obey you as well as we did Moses. It's like, oh, I'm in trouble. I'm in trouble. Well, verse 10 now to verse 12. But since then there has not arisen in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. And all the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt before Pharaoh, before all his servants, and in all his land. And by all that mighty power and all the great terror which Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. I will have to agree. There really has not been a story that's trumped this story of Moses in leading the children out of Israel and all things God did. And then to Joshua to be handed off to take him to the promised land. That is quite the story. And boy, it sure seems like the Lord has real calling on Moses. You know, I love the fact last week it says in Moses 120 he'd be gathered together with his people. And then the next time we see Moses, the Mount of Transfiguration, he's hanging out with Elijah and Jesus, gathered with his people. Now we do know there's two guys that are going to be the witnesses in the tribulation period. And one of them does the same plagues that Moses did. And that's why most people believe Moses is going to come back and have another ministry in human flesh during the tribulation period for 3.5 years. That would be something, wouldn't it? Moses, okay, I'm going to lay you down here, and then, oh, by the way, your job's not done. You're going to go back into his human flesh and die again, and you got another 3.5 years of ministry. I don't know, maybe he's like, all right, put me in, coach, woohoo, you know, he's ready to go by then. I don't know. But we do know there's two witnesses that God's going to use that are going to have these mighty ministry. And most believe Moses is for sure is one of them.